On the afternoon of April 6, 1940-5, an unprecedented storm of steel was brewing. The waters of Tokuyama Oil Depot shimmered under a leaden gray light as the battleship Yamato slowly departed the pier, carrying just enough fuel to reach Okinawa and no plan for the return journey. The force designated a surface special attack unit sailed under a name that carried only one meaning in the Imperial Japanese Navy of April 1940-5, the same designation given to the teenage pilots who flew their aircraft into American warships. The largest battleship in the world was being sent to Okinawa by the same logic that had been sending 18-year-old boys to their deaths since October of 1940-4. By the following afternoon, the Yamato lay at the bottom of the East China Sea. Of her 3,330 to crew members, 2,490-8 never came back. 380-6 American aircraft struck into waves, 11 torpedoes, 6 bombs. From the first torpedo hit to the moment the magazines detonated, only 2 hours. 6 months earlier, the Musashi, the Yamato's identical sister ship, had endured 9 hours under the same kind of attack. The vice admiral who commanded this mission had called it futile before agreeing to lead it. The Americans had decrypted the operational orders 11 days before the Yamato left port. The Americans who knew about the mission before it began lost only 10 aircraft. The Yamato's crew had loaded 1,170 main gun shells, 9 18-inch guns, 13,500 anti-aircraft shells, and 11.5 million rounds of machine gun ammunition, but it was far from enough. The Yamato and the Musashi were the same ship built twice, same hull, same guns, same armor. The Musashi was sunk in October of 1940- for without ever having fired her main guns at an enemy surface vessel in combat. The Yamato fired her main guns at enemy ships exactly once, against outmatched escort carriers, a battle that should not have been in doubt, yet ended with a withdrawal order. Both perished from the air. The 2 largest warships in the history of naval warfare, built at enormous cost, died without ever accomplishing what they were designed to do. To understand why the Yamato was at the Tokuyama Oil Depot on April 6, 1940-5, you must look back 6 months to the fate of her sister ship and everything the Imperial Navy endured in between. During the Battle of the Sea by Sea on October 20-4, 1940-4, the Yamato witnessed the destruction of the Musashi firsthand. Both ships were part of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force, the most powerful Japanese surface fleet still operational. American aviators chose to concentrate on the Musashi, hitting her with 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over 9 hours, until she sank at 1930-6. The Yamato, sailing in the same formation, received only 1 torpedo and 2 bomb hits. That night, Kurita brought what remained of the center force through the San Bernardino straightened into the Philippine Sea. In the early morning of October 20-5, the Yamato's 18-inch guns fired at the escort carriers of Taffy 3 in the only surface engagement of her career. The Yamato had been built for exactly this kind of action, facing ships so outclassed that the outcome should not have been in doubt. Yet Kurita ordered a withdrawal before the battle concluded, and the Yamato returned to Japan, having fired her main guns at enemy ships for the first and last time, with nothing to show for it. The significance of the Taffy 3 engagement lay not only in what the Yamato failed to accomplish, but in what it revealed about the condition of the Japanese Navy by October 1940-4. A force that included the Yamato, 3 other battleships, and 6 heavy cruisers had engaged escort carriers designed for anti-submarine patrol, not fleet combat. The escort carriers had virtually no armor and their aircraft were not equipped for ship-to-minus ship attacks. By any standard of fleet combat, they were overwhelmingly outmatched, yet they were not overwhelmed. Their escorting destroyers and destroyer escorts charged the Japanese formation in attacks that should have resulted in their destruction, but instead disrupted Japanese fire control long enough for the escort carriers to disperse, When Kurita ordered the withdrawal, the Yamato's guns fell silent. She had been engaged for approximately 2 hours with forces that should not have been capable of defending themselves, and she was sailing away from them. After the Battle of Samar, the Yamato returned to Kure with the knowledge of what she had not accomplished. She was the most powerful surface combatant in the world, and she had been given the opportunity to use that power, and she sat at anchor, a port on the inland sea within range of American bombers, but still offering the illusion of security that open ocean no longer provided. Fuel was the central problem. Japan's access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies had been effectively severed by American submarine operations and dare attacks on supply routes. The Navy had enough fuel to conduct operations, but not enough to waste them. A fleet of destroyers could be fueled from what was available, but a battleship the size of the Yamato consumed fuel at a rate that required specific strategic justification for every movement. From November 1940-4 through February 1940-5, the most powerful warship in the world sat idle while the war moved past her. American forces took Iwo Jima and began preparing the invasion of Okinawa. The Japanese High Command was planning what they called Kaitsu-Go, the decisive battle for the home islands. The Yamato's role in that plan was never fully defined. She was an asset without a viable mission. On April 1, 1940-5, American forces landed on Okinawa. The first day of fighting established that this would be a different kind of campaign. Okinawa was Japanese home territory in a way the Pacific Islands had not been. The civilian population was substantial, the defenders numerous and well supplied by Japanese standards. They knew that what happened on Okinawa would determine the conditions under which the home islands themselves were defended. If Okinawa fell, American air bases on the island would bring every part of the Japanese home islands within range of bombers. B-20-9 bombers already reaching Japan from the Mariana Islands would be supplemented by tactical aircraft operating from Okinawa, just 40 miles from Kyushu. The defense of Okinawa was not simply a military operation, it was the last geographic barrier before the home islands themselves. The options available to the Japanese Navy in response to the Okinawa invasion were limited by what the Navy had left. The carrier aviation that had been the decisive arm of Japanese naval power had been destroyed at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. The remaining surface fleet was substantial in individual ship quality, but crippled by fuel shortage and the absence of air cover. The submarine force was operational but had not reversed the American tide. The primary offensive capability Japan possessed was the kamikaze program, which had demonstrated it could impose serious costs on the American fleet. The planners who designed Operation 10-Go looked at what they had and produced a plan that reflected the logic of the moment. The Yamato, the cruiser WWII, and 8 destroyers would sortie from Japan, transit south through the East China Sea, arrive at Okinawa, engage the American amphibious fleet, and beach themselves on the Okinawan shore, if necessary, to continue fighting as stationary gun platforms. Simultaneously, more than 350 kamikaze aircraft would attack the American carrier task forces in what was designated Kaiku Suai. The designation of the Yamato's force as a surface special attack unit was not incidental language. Vice Admiral Saiichi Ito stated explicitly that the Yamato and her escorts would be sunk by American air attack before reaching Okinawa, and that the men aboard would die without materially affecting the outcome of the battle. His superiors listened to his assessment and kept the mission anyway. The decision to proceed despite Ito's objections was not made out of ignorance. The officers who overruled him understood, as he did, that the Yamato would almost certainly be sunk before reaching Okinawa. Their calculation was that the Yamato's sortie, combined with the mass kamikaze attack of Kutsui No. 1, might draw sufficient American attention away from the Okinawa landing area to create tactical opportunities. They also understood something rarely stated explicitly but widely understood: allowing the Yamato to remain at anchor while the war ended was not a viable option. The largest warship Japan had ever built dying at anchor would mean something more unbearable than defeat itself. Ito accepted command. He had made his professional judgment through the appropriate channels. The judgment had been overruled, and what came after was his duty. He carried it out as he had carried every previous assignment, thoroughly, professionally, without visible reservation. On March 20-9th, the Yamato began loading ammunition. 1,170 shells for 9 18-inch guns, 1,620-9 shells for the secondary battery, 13,500 anti-aircraft shells, 11.5 million rounds for the machine guns. The loading was thorough and careful. The men who loaded the ammunition knew what it was for. Loading 1,170 shells for 18-inch guns is not a quick process. Each shell weighs over a ton and requires dozens of men working in confined spaces with careful coordination. The fuel loading was more complicated. The standard account holds that the Yamato received only enough fuel for the outward journey. Later analysis of Japanese records suggests she received as much fuel as was available, which happened to be insufficient for a return trip. The practical result was the same. If the Yamato survived long enough to want to return, she would not have the fuel to do so. The mission was designed without a return phase because the planners did not expect one to be necessary. The Americans did not learn about the operation from Japanese communications alone. On March 20-6th, 11 days before the Yamato's departure, American signals intelligence units intercepted and deciphered the execute order for Operation Tem-Go. The intercept was forwarded to Admiral Spruance, who sent a brief message to his forces: "You take them on." In the days that followed, additional intercepts refined the intelligence picture. The Americans knew the approximate timing of the sortie, the composition of the force, and the route south through the Bungo Strait. When the Yamato departed on April 6th and American submarines spotted her passing through the strait, there were no surprises on the American side. The submarine USS Threadfin sent a contact report in the clear, and the American carrier task forces began positioning for the intercept. Inside the Yamato, the situation was far less clear. Ensign Mitsu Yoshida was the ship's junior radar officer, 20-2 years old, part of a generation of Japanese naval officers who had spent their entire service careers in a war that was going badly. He was assigned to the Yamato in the final weeks before the operation and found himself aboard a ship preparing for a mission described in terms no one on board could fully interpret. The official briefing said the mission was to support the defense of Okinawa, but the unofficial conversations running through the ship's compartments carried a different assessment. On April 5th, the day before departure, orders came to put certain crew members ashore. Cadets aboard for training were told to disembark. The crew who remained were not told explicitly what this meant, but the arithmetic was clear to anyone who worked through it. The evening of April 5th, the ship at anchor, the coast of Japan visible from the deck. Officers moved through the compartments. Sake was distributed in the traditional gesture marking significant operations. Veterans who had served through late Gulf noted that this felt different from previous departures. Previous departures had a return built into them. Morale aboard the Yamato in the hours before departure was described by survivors as poor, not defeated, not broken, but not the morale of men who believed they were sailing into a battle they could win. They were sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy, trained to serve and to die in service if necessary, and the necessity of dying in service had become the dominant fact of their professional existence over the preceding year. What most of them felt in those final hours took different forms in different men. Some wrote letters, some drank the sake distributed by officers, some stood at the rails watching the Japanese coast recede as the formation cleared the harbor. Yoshida overheard a conversation between senior officers that gave him information he had not been officially provided. The Second Fleet's mission was not only to attack the American amphibious fleet at Okinawa, but also to serve as a lure, drawing American carrier aircraft away from the Okinawa landing area and creating a window during which the kamikaze aircraft of Kuraksui No. 1 could strike. The Yamato was being sent to die as a distraction as much as a weapon. He wrote about what he heard, what he saw in the days that followed. His account includes details about the days before departure that no official record captured, the quality of the food the officers shared in the wardroom the night before sailing, the conversations between men who understood what the operation required and were trying to talk about other things. He noted that some men wrote letters to their families. Some of those letters were mailed from Kure before departure. Some were kept in pockets against the chance of a later opportunity that everyone understood was unlikely. He survived the sinking unpublished his account after the war, published in Japan in 1950- to his requiem for Battleship Yamato. He survived because he was pulled from the water. Most of his shipmates were not. Of the 3,330- to men who sailed, 2,490-8 did not return. The morning of April 7, 1940-5, found the Yamato and her escort still moving south through the East China Sea. American scout planes had been tracking the force since before dawn. Position reports flowed back to the carrier task forces that had been positioned for the intercepts since Spruance issued his order 2 days earlier. Vice Admiral Mark M. I. Tischer, commanding the carrier task forces, had his aircraft loaded and ready. He had more aircraft than the Yamato had anti-mine aircraft guns. He knew where she was going, and how fast she was moving. The first wave of American aircraft arrived over the Yamato's position at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon. The force that came was large enough to address every asset in the Japanese formation simultaneously. The Yamato was the primary target. Her escorts drew their own attacks. The destroyer Hamakaze was sunk in the opening minutes. The cruiser Yaeji, I was struck by torpedoes and bombs early in the first wave and ceased to be an effective anti-mine aircraft platform within the first hour. The forces that were supposed to defend the Yamato were being eliminated, and the Yamato's own anti-mine aircraft guns were fighting against odds that grew worse with each incoming aircraft. The torpedoes came from the port side, a deliberate tactical choice learned from the destruction of the Musashi 6 months earlier. In October 1940-4, American pilots attacking the Musashi had distributed their torpedoes more or less equally between both sides, forcing damage control crews to counter flood on both sides and producing a slower accumulation of list. The Yamato was attacked differently. Torpedo planes concentrated on the port side. Each torpedo hit added to the port list without the corresponding pressure from the starboard side. The list grew steadily and without the possibility of being counteracted by symmetric flooding. The Yamato's crew fought the list with the same methods used 6 months earlier, counter flooding on the starboard side, moving every available weight to the high side, pumping water from port compartments at maximum capacity, but none of it was sufficient. The pumps could not outpace the flooding because the flooding was coming faster than the pumps had been designed for, and more torpedoes were still arriving. Inside the ship, Ensign Yoshida was at his radar station when the first torpedoes hit. He recorded what the interior of the ship felt and sounded like during the attack. The concussions from torpedo hits transmitted through the hull as physical sensations, pressure changes felt in the chest and ears before they could be consciously identified as explosions. Lights flickered. Compartments that had been accessible minutes before became inaccessible as flooding spread. Damage control parties sealed or attempted to seal breaches. The men at their stations were doing their jobs, continuing to operate the equipment they were responsible for, because that was what training produced when nothing else was left. On the upper decks, the anti-mine aircraft crews fought a different kind of battle. The sky above the Yamato was filled with American aircraft, and the men at the gun mounts fired at targets coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The Yamato carried a massive anti-mine aircraft battery, substantially upgraded since her early service, and the volume of fire she produced was considerable. It was not sufficient for 380-6 aircraft. American pilots who made their attack runs later described the anti-mine aircraft fire as heavy but less accurate than expected. The ship's increasing list was affecting the gunners' ability to track targets effectively. A gun mount designed to operate on a level deck performs differently on a deck tilting toward the water. The second wave of aircraft arrived at approximately 1 in the afternoon, while the Yamato was still fighting fires and flooding from the first wave. The second wave concentrated on continuing the torpedo attack started by the first, deepening the list further. By this point, the Yamato's speed had decreased significantly. Her maneuverability was compromised by flooding and list. The anti-mine aircraft crews who had survived the first wave fought through smoke and damage, enduring the accumulating physical effects of sustained combat. Between the two attack waves, the Yamato's damage control teams made their last efforts. Counter-minus flooding on the starboard side had consumed water storage capacity, now needed for other purposes. The pumps were not running at full capacity and not keeping pace with incoming water. Officers directed men to physically move equipment and ammunition from port to starboard, the same desperate measure her sister ship's crew had employed with rice and timber 6 months earlier. By the time the second wave arrived, the Yamato was past the point where such measures could be effective. The crew knew the men moving ammunition from one side to the other knew that the amount they could move would not correct a list produced by flooding on a ship of this size. They moved it anyway, because that was what the order said, and because the alternative to following an order was standing still. At 14:20-3 in the afternoon, approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes after the first attack wave arrived, the Yamato's list reached a point from which recovery was impossible. The ship was going to capsize. The order to abandon ship was given. The chaos that followed was the chaos of a 70,000-ton ship rolling while thousands of men tried to get clear of it. The anti-aircraft guns that had been firing minutes ago now above the men in the water, and then they were gone. The superstructure that had risen above the waterline since the Yamato was commissioned at Kure in December 1940-1 went under. The hull rolled past vertical, and then the magazines detonated. The explosion when the Yamato's ammunition magazines ignited was visible from approximately 200 miles away. It was the largest single explosion in the history of naval warfare to that point. The ships still afloat in the formation attempted to recover survivors from the water after the Yamato went under. The destroyers Fuyutsuki and Yukikes, 2 of the 8 that had departed with the Yamato, were still operational. They moved through the debris field recovering men from the water. The water was covered with oil from the Yamato's ruptured fuel tanks and with wreckage produced by the explosion and sinking. Men who had been in the water for any length of time were fighting hypothermia from the sea temperature and exhaustion from the effort of staying afloat. Some were injured. Some were too far from the rescue ships to be reached in time. The destroyers could not remain stationary. American submarines were in the area, and a stationary destroyer was a stationary target. Rescue operations were conducted while moving, and the time available was limited. Yoshida was in the water when the magazines went. He described being pushed under the surface by the force of the explosion, fighting to the surface again, looking around at an ocean that had been full of men seconds before and was now empty. He was pulled from the water by a rescue ship. 260-9 men from the Yamato were rescued. 3,060-3 were dead or missing. Vice Admiral Saiichi Ito had refused to be evacuated. He went to his quarters before the Endant was still there when the ship went under. Captain Kosaku Ariga, the Yamato's last captain, had been seen on the bridge as the ship capsized. Survivor accounts describe him as having lashed himself to the binnacle, the compass mounting, so that he would not be separated from the ship in the final moments. He was not seen after the capsizing. He was 50 years old at his death. The American aircraft returned to their carriers. American losses in the engagement were 10 aircraft and 12 aviators, 10 planes and 12 men in exchange for the largest warship in history, her cruiser escort, 4 destroyers, and 3,460-5 sailors. It was the last major surface action of the Pacific War. 4 factors determined the Yamato's fate. The first was the loss of surprise. The Americans had known the Yamato was coming before she left port. By the time she cleared the Bungo Strait, Spruance had already positioned his carrier task forces for the intercept and issued instructions to his commanders. Whatever tactical advantage her armor and guns might have provided in a different situation was negated before the engagement began. The second was the torpedo concentration tactic, the lessons drawn from the destruction of the Musashi in October 1940-4 had been incorporated into American attack doctrine by April 1940-5. The identical sister ship had lasted 9 hours under more distributed attack. The Yamato lasted 2 hours under concentrated attack. The difference was not in the ships. It was in what the American pilots had learned from the first engagement. The third was the absence of air cover. The Yamato had sailed with the understanding that she would have minimal air cover between 6 and 10 in the morning on April 7th. after which she would be on her own. The cover provided was insufficient. The American carrier task forces operated more than 350 aircraft across to attack waves. The Japanese aircraft assigned to cover the Yamato could not prevent the attacks from developing. This ship, designed to fight in an era when carrier aviation was theoretically manageable, was fighting in an era when it was no longer manageable. The fourth was what the mission itself represented, a force sent without a viable plan for return, whose commander had described it as futile before agreeing to lead it, was not a force operating at full effectiveness. Morale aboard the Yamato in the final hours before and during the attack was the morale of men who knew what the outcome was likely to be. This did not mean they did not fight. They did fight. The anti-aircraft crews fired until they could no longer fire. The damage control parties worked until they could no longer work. But there is a difference between a force fighting to win and a force fighting to win, and by April 1940-5, the Yamato was the latter. The paradox at the center of the Yamato's existence is what she was built for and what she was used for. She was the most powerful surface warship ever constructed. Her 9 18-inch guns could hurl weighing over a ton to distances beyond 40 kilometers. Her built armor was 410 millimeters of steel, designed to defeat any shell any enemy ship could fire. Her designers created a ship that could defeat any surface opponent in a conventional naval engagement. And they succeeded. No surface force the Allies possessed could have sunk the Yamato in a gun duel. But the Yamato was never in a gun duel with an opponent capable of defeating her. She fired her main guns at enemy ships exactly once, at the escort carriers of Taffy 3, and was ordered to withdraw before the engagement concluded. She was then sent to die as the naval equivalent, without enough fuel to return, designated a surface special attack unit. Her sister ship, the Musashi, had been destroyed 6 months earlier under similar circumstances, overwhelming air power, no air cover, a mission requiring her to cross open water in daylight. Both ships were the same, both died the same way. Together they represented the largest naval construction project in Japanese history, costing resources that Japan could not afford and producing capabilities that Japan was never able to use as intended. The loss of the Yamato removed from the Japanese Navy its last operational capital ship of significance. The Second Fleet that had sortied D with her was effectively destroyed in the engagement. What remained of Japanese naval power after April 7, 1940-5 was submarines, smaller surface craft, and the kamikaze program. The surface fleet, constructed at enormous cost over the preceding 2 decades, that had struck Pearl Harbor, fought at Midway, engaged at Guadalcanal, in the Philippine Sea, and at Leyte Gulf, was effectively gone. The significance of the Yamato's loss was understood in Tokyo almost immediately. The Naval General Staff had expected her to be sunk. They had sent her knowing the probable outcome. What they had not fully anticipated was how quickly it happened or how completely the operation failed to accomplish its stated objectives. The kamikaze attacks of Kikusui, No. 1, that were supposed to coordinate with the Yamato sortie, were conducted and inflicted damage on the American fleet, but did not drive the American fleet away from Okinawa. The invasion continued. The battle for the island lasted until late June, producing casualty figures that made it the bloodiest engagement of the entire Pacific campaign. The Yamato had been sent to prevent this. She had been destroyed before reaching Okinawa. The battle happened without her. In 1980-5, a Japanese expedition discovered the Yamato. She lies at approximately 340 meters depth in the East China Sea, northwest of Okinawa, her hull containing the remains of many of the 2,490 men who went down with her. The wreck is in 2 main sections separated by the force of the magazine explosion. The bow section is relatively intact. The stern section, where the explosions originated, is scattered across a wider debris field. Subsequent surveys documented the physical record of what aircraft and explosion had done to a ship designed to be unsinkable by surface fire. Japan commissioned a full scale replica of the Yamato at a museum in Kure, the city where she was built. The replica stands to the exact dimensions of the original, housed in a museum dedicated to the history of the Japanese Navy in the Second World War. The city that built the most powerful battleship in history and watched her sail away and not return has been living with that fact for 80 years. The museum receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, many of them descendants of men who served aboard the Yamato, who built her, or who watched her leave the harbor for the last time. If you want more stories about the most powerful warships in history and the missions that defined them, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. I am your Naval History Observer, and I will see you on the next mission. Remember the Yamato, and remember the men who sailed on her.